Hi and welcome to the Arctic. We're broadcasting live from the UK Arctic Research Station as part of AXA XL Arctic Live. It's wonderful to have you all with us. We have schools from the USA, Panama, Colombia, Canada, and the UK. And a special shout out to Dr. Ceri Lewis, joining us
Hello.
for this microplastics expert interview. We have a special shout out to all the students at Peters Colony Elementary in the Colony, Texas, USA.
Hello.
Hi. I'm not going to say that twice. We also have Riverside Public School, Lawrence Intermediate School, King's College, Panama, INEM in Colombia, Livingston High School, and Union Point Academy watching. So a big hello to all the students there. A quick note, actually, Ceri is at Lawrence Intermediate School, are the only school to have joined every single Arctic Live.
Oh, well done. That's great.
So big thumbs up and big thank you to Mr. B, the teacher there.
Awesome.
Fantastic. So Ceri, what we're going to do today is we are going to pop outside and show all these wonderful students a bit of a view around the Arctic, and then we'll come back in and answer some of their questions about life and science in the Arctic and microplastics and plastics in general. I'm not quite sure how windy it is, but when we do go outside, we are holding this close to our mouths, and here we go. We have to have everything wired up here, just because we're not allowed any sort of mobile signals or Wi-Fi or anything, as that interferes with the scientific instrumentation. So we are in Ny-Ålesund. Ny-Ålesund is the northernmost permanent community in the world. It is on the island of Svalbard, and that is halfway between the top of Norway and the North Pole. So if you keep on going that way, for 11 degrees of latitude, you get to the North Pole. We're currently at 79 north, and the North Pole, of course, being at 90 degrees north. But I'm just going to hand over the microphone to Ceri, who's going to describe what we've been sampling over the past week.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, hopefully you can see behind me this rather beautiful fjord. This is King's Fjord, with several rather enormous, incredible glaciers coming down into the fjord. And we've been sampling the whole length of this fjord, looking for microplastics and also collecting some data on the ocean chemistry. It's a really interesting place to work because it goes from being sort of relatively shallow up by the glaciers, about 40-50 meters, but then it really suddenly gets really deep to 200 and 300 meters in quite a short space of time. And then we've got these lovely deep waters all along the fjord, so deep that just the other day we had 2 blue whales swimming up the fjord, and they're the biggest animal on the planet. So for the fjord to be able to fit 2 of those quite happily, that tells you quite how big and deep the water is here. The fact that it's so deep means we also get some layers in the water. So these glaciers that are melting into the water, they form a freshwater layer on the surface, and then we have the colder Arctic deep water layer coming in underneath. And that enables us to look at the different layers and see where the plastics are in these different layers and how that affects the water chemistry. So it's a really interesting place to work.
And Ceri, the first time we worked together in the Arctic was we were sleeping on the sea, on the sea ice, rather chilly. I think we had average temperatures hovering around -35. But this time it's slightly different. We're based in a research station. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm very happy that we're not camping this time. Camping at -40 is really quite hard. But here we have a really nice and warm research station. We have little bedrooms each with a nice cosy bed. We have hot showers, and we have somewhere to make tea really easily. Very important things when you're a British scientist is to be able to have a cup of tea. So I'm very glad we can make that easily. But it means we can come in after a cold day on the water and warm up quite quickly, which is also really good.
And it's not just a UK station, we're in an international science community up here. And we have stations from Norway, Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, UK, South Korea, China, Japan, and India. What is it like being part of an international science community? Pretty well far away from most other places.
Well, it's fantastic. And in particular, we are collaborating with the Norwegian scientists that are here. They're going to help analyse quite a lot of our water samples for us. But we're here asking questions about global challenges, the changing planet. And obviously, this affects all of us. So to be able to collaborate with scientists from all over the world is really important to be able to help us answer these very important questions.
Brilliant. And sorry, just grab that. It is wonderful to be out in the water. What I just love for you to share with the students watching is what this landscape makes you feel like, because we've had a glimpse of it, but for me it's a great treat to be up here. So if you could just sort of we'll show them the view and just describe how it feels to be here.
It really is a very magical place to work. So hopefully you can see from the images you're looking at just how amazing the light here is. We are actually on 24 hours daylight at the moment. So the sun is not setting. It is just moving around us in a big circle every day. So that really makes you feel like you are actually on top of the world because the sun is just kind of going around the sky around you. It's cold, obviously, and that gives the air quite a magical quality. Sometimes you get little ice crystals in the air and it gets little sort of rainbow effects. So it really is very, very magical. But it's also quite a powerful environment because the cold can really get you quite quickly. A little bit of an increase in the wind and the temperature will suddenly really drop, and you have to be really careful working up here. You could get frostnip or frostbite if you're not careful. So it's a brutal, beautiful place. But it's also really fragile. This is the place where we're seeing the impacts of climate change first and fastest. So it's that juxtaposition between it being so powerful, so big, so beautiful, but also so fragile and being impacted by our activities. So it's really quite an incredible place to work as a scientist.
And just before we go in, just a sort of little piece of information. People often wonder about Arctic ice and a little bit of confusion between sea ice and glacier ice. And just want to tell you how icebergs form. And we actually have encountered a number of icebergs. I'm rather interested in one of them that came quite close to our little research boat. But if we just look at the Chronobrine, and that's a big glacier, the sort of bluer glacier at the end, an incredibly fast-moving glacier, moving at about 3 meters a day at the moment. We can see it's very jaggedy, lots of cracks. Icebergs form from land ice breaking off into the sea. So if you've ever seen a picture of an iceberg and wondered, well, how do they form? It is bits of glacier, like the glacier you're seeing at the moment, breaking off into the sea and then floating down the fjord. We have different types of sort of iceberg accumulation. If the wind is blowing from behind us towards the end of the fjord, they all collect down there, which makes navigation quite tricky. If the wind is blowing from the end of the fjord, then we actually get them sailing past the research station, which is rather wonderful to see. But even though it's not as cold as it could be, probably only about -5, it's getting a bit nippy. So we'll go back inside and have a look at some of the questions that the students may have for us. Come back in, close the door, keep the Arctic air outside, enjoy being in a research station and the warmth. And clip this back on down here so they can hear both of us. So, Ceri, before we start, maybe just briefly describe what your role is generally in your job, and then your role on Arctic Life.
Well, I'm a marine biologist and I've been studying the impacts of what we call anthropogenic stresses, which are human-induced stress change on the marine environment, and how that impacts the health of the smaller marine animals that we find at the bottom of the food chain. So marine invertebrates, things like crabs, mussels, starfish, zooplankton. So I've been working first on climate change, then oil pollution, then ocean acidification, and now plastics. These are all stresses that are affecting the health of marine animals in our oceans. I've been doing that for 20 years now. I'm quite old.
And then all that background in studying these stresses that we are putting on the marine environment, what is your role on Arctic Life?
So I'm the lead scientist of this particular expedition. Here we're studying two things: microplastics and also ocean acidification, which is the change in the ocean chemistry that's being driven by increasing carbon dioxide. So we're looking at both of those questions with this trip, and these are both things that we know impact little marine animals.
And how were you inspired, Ceri, to follow this career path? Because I mean, it sounds amazing the work that you're doing, but it is not normally on the sort of careers advice form that you get. I mean, I think I had lawyer and dustbin man.
Yes. Well, I fell in love with weird and wonderful small marine creatures when I was about 2 or 3, and I did my first ever rock pooling trip, and I haven't stopped loving rock pooling ever since. I didn't know I could do that for a job. I am basically a professional rock pooler these days, which is amazing. It is the best job in the world. But I didn't know that I could turn that. I just kept asking questions, and I pursued the questions I was interested in. That took me to university to do a degree in marine biology. I still had lots of questions, and I realised I could carry on studying, and somehow that turned into a job. But it's just about being enthusiastic and being driven by something that really interests you, and that can take you to all sorts of exciting places.
Amazing. And we'll come on to some of the questions that we've got through from Peter's Colony Elementary. But I just love that idea of curiosity, and that being an incredibly important part of being a scientist. How important is curiosity? How can students continue with that, even though they don't become a professional scientist? And where is your curiosity taking you?
Oh my goodness!
Lots of questions there.
Well, I think curiosity is the ultimate trait of a scientist. It's someone who looks at something and goes, "Oh, what's that? How does that work?" And that's what I do pretty much every day. Is I look at things and go, And we never come up with eureka moments. Actually, most of the time when we find out something really new, we kind of go, okay, I wasn't expecting that to happen. And that's where you learn the new things. So I think that's a fundamental character trait of someone who wants to be a scientist. But just being amazed by the things around you is also really important. Now, what was the other part of the question?
A roll call of where your curiosity has taken you.
Oh my goodness, I am very lucky. I've been to some very wonderful places. Just recently I was in the Galapagos Islands, where they also find plastics on the beaches there. I've been to the Azores, another volcanic island chain with a plastic problem. The Arctic a few times, which I think is my favourite place. I lived in South Africa for a few years, so it's a fantastic job for travelling, and I've been very, very lucky.
Amazing. And turning now to these questions from Peter's Colony, when did you first begin researching microplastics? Obviously, it's had a huge amount of media attention in the past years. Have you been studying it for longer?
I work in a wider research group at Exeter University, which collaborates with Plymouth University, and my 2 professors there were probably some of the first people to start working on microplastics. I've personally been working on it for 7 years, but the group that I'm part of have been working on it since 2004. Wow. So quite a long time. A lot of people in the world are now working on microplastics, but probably we're one of the first groups to start asking these questions.
Amazing. And we've come here to answer some of those questions. Why choose the Arctic Ocean for this bit of research rather than another ocean?
Well, we have been looking in lots of different places. The questions I'm really interested in as a biologist is, where is the plastic encountering biology? So a lot of work has been done looking at the ocean gyres. This is where the big ocean currents concentrate plastics right in the middle of the big oceans. But actually these oceans are ocean deserts. There's not a lot of nutrients in the middle of the gyres, and without nutrients there's not much life. So actually where it's most likely to encounter zooplankton, tiny marine animals, is where you get high concentrations of plastic meeting nutrient-rich waters. Now the Arctic is very nutrient-rich, and when the sun is up, which is only half the year, but when the sun is up it's hugely productive. It bursts into life and there's lots and lots of zooplankton. We also know that the Arctic has a current that comes in and probably brings quite a lot of plastic in from the North Atlantic gyre. So it's looking like the Arctic is another hotspot of plastics, but it's one where there's animals that might actually eat the plastic as well.
And we can see that it's a very productive environment, because we're not going to get a blue whale
No.
up here if there's not a lot to eat.
No, we've seen a lot of whales this week. It's been fantastic. Just this morning, we had a pod of about 50 beluga whales encircling us on the boat, which was magical. That was amazing. And they wouldn't be here if there was lots without the food to support them.
And, microplastics is obviously a big concern for a lot of the classes watching. What is the best way for kids to help solve the problem of microplastic? And that question coming from Peter's Colony again.
That's a really good question, and I think that's a good one to be asking, because everybody can do lots of little things to reduce the amount of unnecessary single-use plastic that they're using in their everyday lives. I think some of the biggest items that we find on beaches when we go and do beach cleaning all around the world are drinks bottles, single-use drink bottles that you use once and then you throw it away. 37% of annual global plastics production goes into items that we use for 15 minutes, and plastic is designed to last for 500 years. So you can instantly see that that's not very sensible. And so that's something we can easily reduce what we use, especially in countries with really nice, safe drinking water. Just fill up a reusable flask rather than buying single-use drink bottles. That will add up to millions and millions of bottles if everybody does just that one thing.
And you use the word unnecessary there, and I think it's quite an important word to consider, because we have had some quite blanket statements going, plastic's bad, anything else good. But there are instances in which plastics are necessary, but there are, as you pointed out, a lot of instances in which plastics are unnecessary.
Absolutely. And we have to always think about our plastic use in the context of other big global challenges like climate change. So plastic sometimes can be the best thing to use for its carbon footprint. So we don't want to get rid of all plastics, but there's an awful lot of plastic that we really don't need to use, and that's what's ending up going into the ocean, and that's what we need to change.
We've got one last question from Peter's Colony, and then we'll move on to Livingston High School. Last question from Peter's Colony is, are there positive things that you have? Is there any good news that you found in your research?
Well, I think having worked on lots of other different chemicals that we find in the oceans, the tiny bits of microplastic that we've been working with in our laboratory studies to see what happens when animals do eat plastic, they're really not as toxic as some of the nastier chemicals like pesticides or oil. So what we find is the zooplankton, they do eat the plastic. They can't tell the difference between tiny little bits of plastic and their natural food, which is little algae, little plant cells. But those plastics will mostly just go through their guts and come out the other end in their poo. So it's not totally toxic. It's not killing them acutely the way some chemicals that we use do. And I think that's a good news, because if plastic was that toxic, we really would be in a lot of trouble, because there's so much plastic out there. Doesn't mean the plastic isn't doing them any harm, but at least it's not so toxic that it's killing them straight away.
Well,
yes, it could
it's
be a
sliver of good news. A sliver of good news. Michael from Livingston High School would like to know how we get supplied up here in such an extreme environment.
Well, it's quite challenging, isn't it, getting ourselves and all of our kit here? I mean, you can probably talk about some of the challenges we faced.
I think that, particularly when you want to do science up here, we've got to bring all our kit with us. There is, the boats up here, and it's great to have a logistics company that operate here, Kings Bay, who provide a lot of support for visiting scientists like ourselves. But we did have to order specific chemicals to come up here, and transporting chemicals is not something you can just put in your hand luggage and cart them up. So that's a problem. But in terms of supplies, the basics are two things. We have a ship that comes in every 6 weeks or so, and that brings a lot of supplies for all of the stations here, so especially food. Very little fresh food.
Yes. We get 1 apple a day, don't we, Jamie?
1 apple a day is our ration. So very little crunchy food. But the food is in fact really good here. But then there are 2 flights on Monday and 2 flights on Thursdays. And then that brings in visiting scientists, urgent resupplies, and the odd apple or 100.
But we do have to be making sure we've packed everything, because if we've forgotten something, that's it. You're not going to get hold of it.
No.
And we have to weigh everything quite carefully, because the plane that does that last little hop is quite small. So we have to make sure we've weighed everything properly.
Yeah. Always wondering whether you're going to get told one of these days that no, that bag can't come, and you have to decide whether you're going to have be rather smelly and not have a set of clean clothes, or whether you're going to leave the science equipment. I know exactly
Leave the clothes behind.
It's smelly,
Bring the
smelly every
kit.
time. Next up, we have Zach and Jake from Livingston High School.
Hello.
Hi, would like to know what issues you face when completing experiments in the extreme cold of the Arctic. How is doing science here different from doing science
Can
elsewhere?
be really difficult. So a good example was last Wednesday, wasn't it, when we were out on the boat and the air temperature was about -10, but it was quite windy, and so that wind brought the wind chill factor to -25. Now seawater starts freezing pretty quickly at -25, and we are putting our Niskin bottles and our plankton nets in and out of the water all the time. So our kit was freezing as we were working, and that actually is quite difficult for getting your sample, but it also means your fingers get really cold, and that was actually quite painful. So we were having to take it in turns to go inside and warm up in the cabin of the boat, and then come out and do the samples, and then go and warm up. And we had some tea again on the boat. Tea is really important to doing good science, I find. So we managed to get through. When the kit freezes, the interesting thing is the best way to defrost it is to actually put it in the sea, because the sea is warmer than the air temperature, which is a bit opposite to how you would normally think. You'd normally think jump in the sea to cool off. But the sea temperature here at the moment is about 1 to 2 degrees. And when it freezes, seawater freezes at -1.8. So it's always going to be slightly warmer than the air temperature here. So if we plunge our kit into the sea, then it's defrosted.
But plunging your fingers into the sea.
No, don't do that.
And it is incredibly painful. I think that, normally when people feel cold, there's a certain cold feeling, whereas the cold in the Arctic has a different quality. I mean, it really is stingy, painful,
it's painful,
properly
and
cold.
It's funny, I never really do the shivery cold. You go from being okay because you've got loads of thermals and big jumpers and hats, and so you're fine 1 minute, and then suddenly you're like, ow, my fingers hurt, I need to stop. And it's always fingers and toes that go first, maybe a nose.
Yeah, it's got a bit of a nose going from time to time. And then some of the other things. I mean, we have had there's been ice around in the nets, and you had some very heavy seas over the weekend.
Yes, so we've had pretty much every condition here over the last week. So we had the really cold day, and then we had a really bouncy day when there was a big swell coming in. I might have fed the fish a little bit that day, but that's fine, keep going. And then we had an absolutely beautiful day when it was warm, not freezing, sunny and flat seas. So we've had every type of condition.
So going back to looking at the harm caused by plastics on marine life and the various ways in that happens, Alec from Livingston High School would like to know, are certain species more tolerant to plastics than others? And is the distribution of animal species you find indicative of plastic pollution levels? So should we take that in two halves?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's not so much about sensitivity or tolerance, it's about how you eat. How you collect your food will make you more or less susceptible to taking up the plastic in the first place. So there's quite a lot of animals at the bottom of the food chain that filter feed, which means they've got kind of frilly little structures, and they draw big volumes of water over these frilly structures, and that collects the little algal cells, which they then feed on. Now, microplastics are quite a lot like little algal cells. So if you've designed a feeding strategy to capture as many particles in the water as possible, you're probably going to capture lots of plastics too. So filter feeders, things like mussels or oysters, they're quite susceptible to bringing in lots of plastics into their tummies. Whereas if you're a predator and you're chasing something and you're grabbing it, you're less likely to bring in all those plastics. But your food might have. So feeding strategy, how you eat, is really quite important in determining how likely you are to ingest lots of microplastics.
Wowee. And the second part of the question is the distribution of animal species indicative of plastic pollution levels? So is there a correlation between those two things?
No, we can't see that at the moment. But what we can see is, like I say, certain animal types. So benthic filter feeders, because we know plastic sinks, they will see more of that plastic than something swimming around the vast ocean. So it's not that we're using species to tell us where the plastics are, but we can kind of expect which species have plastics in them compared to others according to where they live in the environment.
Am I allowed one follow-up question, which I'm always personally interested in, is seabirds, because from what little bits I've heard,
Yeah.
are being sort of quite badly affected by plastics.
Yeah, and it does seem that they are one of the most sensitive species, and that they are being quite negatively affected. But they're eating slightly, not just microplastics,
Yes.
they're getting some of those larger sort of bottle top size pieces and larger fragments that then really do block the stomach. So that's a little bit different from a microplastic, which might pass through a gut and come out again. Once they start to get a bit bigger, they get stuck, they cause abrasions, they can perforate guts, and then things become much more serious for these species. And yes, unfortunately, an awful lot of our seabirds are being quite badly affected by plastic pollution in general.
Whoosh.
Yeah, it's not nice.
Gabby, looking at solutions here, Gabby from Livingston High School has noted that a lot of restaurants have stopped using plastic straws. Is this a prudent step for controlling marine plastics, and what additional steps would you like to see? Perhaps it's just if we focus on restaurants.
Yes. Well, certainly we don't need plastic straws, and it's a good start in showing that we want to change our plastic habit. But I have to say, in all of the sampling I've done around the world, I've never found a plastic straw in my samples. They're a small, tiny fraction of the plastic that is entering our sea. So we need to do so much more. But like I say, it's a really good first step because we really don't need plastic straws. But we need to be reducing all of these big single-use plastic items that we use. The drinks bottles, the carrier bags, coffee cups is another really bad one. Yeah. We need to do so much more than just straws.
Brilliant. So I mean, it's really that almost like convenience, eating, that is really where we're seeing the use, or the unnecessary use, to coin your term, of yes. plastics in the food industry. So cut down on that.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Aidan would like to know what measures do you think can be taken to spread awareness and make this issue a bigger presence in a normal citizen's life. So obviously, we, probably speaking, and probably some of the students and teachers watching, have a natural interest yes. in this topic and are environmentally aware. How do you then take this to a more, Joe public?
Well, I always think that you need to start working with where you are, where you live, where you work, where you go to school, and start getting everybody involved in some positive actions to reduce how much plastic you're using, or even just do a plastic audit. Look for a week at how much single-use plastic you are using in your everyday life. Keep it in a bathtub and imagine that's the ocean. I think that's a fantastic way to just start thinking about, this is how much I'm using, how do I start reducing it? Yeah. Then start trying to do something. If your school is still using straws, start a campaign to stop that. Because I think awareness is really increased a lot in the last year all around the world, but we don't need awareness, we need actions. We need to actually start doing something about our plastics. So just realising what we're using first, and then little things to start nibbling away at those uses, I think are really important.
Brilliant. So start where you are, analyse where the problem is, and take action, and bring everybody with you. And is there a way that we can do this in a sensitive way, rather than blaming other people, saying you're a bad person, you're an albatross murderer for having a Starbucks coffee or a takeaway coffee?
Well, I don't think we can play the blame game here. We know we're all using single-use plastic, so I think it's taking a little bit of personal responsibility and just looking at what you're doing that you can change. Little things add up very quickly. An example from the UK is we introduced a 5p charge for a plastic carrier bag in supermarkets. 5p is really not very much at all, but just that small charge has dramatically changed the amount of plastic bags that we're being used in supermarkets. And we can see that in our ocean sampling. We are now finding much less, about 50% less plastic bags in our sampling effort around UK waters, just from that 5p charge. So small things can add up to big differences quite quickly.
And so it seems, starting from a place of love, of loving the marine environment and really caring for it, and then helping others to care and love it too, and then that then driving the behaviour, rather than, as you're saying, getting involved in the blame game.
Yeah.
Perfect. So a lot more love. There we go.
Always, Jamie.
Great. We have questions now from INEM in Colombia. Uraldo would like to know what species are most affected due to microplastics.
I mean, that's a very good question. I'm not sure we have good answers for that at the moment. We know that most mouths, stomachs that we look in, we will find plastics, but whether it's affecting them or not is very difficult to assess. The seabirds are a really good example where we really do know that those slightly bigger bits of plastic are definitely causing those animals harm. But when it gets smaller and it's microplastics, it's kind of hard to tell. But we do know they are in pretty much every stomach in the ocean that we look for them in.
And what are the kind of questions that scientists are asking at the moment? Because obviously this is an area of scientific interest and global concern. You know, is this microplastic causing harm?
Yeah.
What kind of questions and how do you go about seeing whether it is?
It's very difficult to ask those questions in the real environment. So what we get from our field work is that how much plastic there is, where it is, what shape, size, type of plastic it is. But it's very difficult to say, is it doing any harm? Because there's so many other things going on in the oceans. Unfortunately, there are many other changes affecting these animals. So we do laboratory experiments where we can control all of the other factors, and it's just the plastic that is the difference between our control and our exposure experiments. And we tend to do these experiments on little things like mussels or zooplankton like copepods, which actually will still tell us an awful lot about how all animals will respond to microplastics in their diet. And then we measure their health. And it's a bit like when you go to the doctors, we can take your blood pressure, your heart rate, look at your diet, see how much we call it DNA damage. When you're stressed, you get more DNA damage. We can measure all of these things and do a health check. And we do find that if you're eating a lot of microplastic in your diet, whilst it's not directly toxic, it's not killing you, it's causing you quite a lot of stress. It's causing you inflammation, irritation, and you're not getting as much energy from your natural food because your tummy's full of things that give you no energy. So you lose weight. So those are the sorts of things that we see in our experiments. But we're probably not doing those experiments at quite the right level for what's really in the environment, because we started doing these experiments 10 years ago when we didn't have all of the environmental data. So the questions scientists are asking now is fine-tuning those questions to make them more like what we now know is in the ocean, and seeing, do we still see these effects at this level? So I find 10 microplastics in most of my mussels that I look at. The 10 microplastics cause harm. But it's actually really difficult when you're looking at a particle that goes through and comes out the other end, because it's got to be 10 microplastics in it the whole time. So these experiments are not easy to do, and that's why we haven't quite got that answer yet. But there's a lot of people working on it now.
Amazing. And moving back to where we are now, Hayley would like to know what it feels like to do research in the Arctic.
We feel very lucky and special to be up here. It really is such an exciting place. But it is challenging. We've all got quite tired from the long days on the boat, and when it's really cold, you do get tired more quickly. Tea and chocolate go a long way to keeping you going. But yes, you quite often have sore fingers when you're working on the boat. And then you do get quite tired. We've all been going to bed quite early this week. As soon as we've had our hot showers and dinners, we're trying to get as much sleep as we can.
And it is 24-hour daylight at the moment. How is that affecting your sleep?
It really messes you up. It's funny because we can be sitting having a chat after dinner, and then suddenly we look at our watches and it's 11 o'clock at night, and we had no idea it was that late because it feels like the middle of the day with the light levels. So I've certainly been using a little eye mask to try and fool my body into thinking it's dark so I can get some sleep. But it really does throw you off. You lose all sense of time.
All sense of time gone. James in Panama at King's College.
Hi, James.
Would like to know if there are other materials other than plastics causing problems in our oceans. How many materials in our oceans are causing problems?
Unfortunately, we make a lot of chemicals, and actually the number of chemicals goes up every year. We're making thousands and thousands of new chemicals all the time. We do have really good environmental testing of all of these chemicals, so if anything is really toxic, it would never go into use. But unfortunately, even concentrations of things like human health, a good example is peat drug. We know that actually it into the water works and comes out of the ocean. And breathing, there's but there's little that we
There's something that I talked about recently, which I think is very important as an archival use, the primary principle. Could you share what you
And that's been talked about with microplastics a lot, because we are still seeing the harm it's causing. Those are absolutely everywhere. So the problem is that we've got really hard evidence, scientific evidence. You're worried about it. Wait here, it's quite bad for the environment. Don't be in before that precautionary principle. You start regulating. You don't wait too late if you wait evidence comes.
Thank you much. Just asking a few questions about.
And I'm like, this is my favourite expedition. That's a close call from Galapagos and the Arctic. They're so different now. It's a life-changing experience. Honestly, at -40, it made me so aware of how it is. I could camp at -40 and go, and that was really powerful for me. So I think that definitely my.
And what's the best thing about your job?
I didn't do a field work and actually is technical. It's my job is sort of teaching marine creatures with the whole next generation who hopefully the future. That's a real. I also get into the Parliament. One of my colleagues has been to the UN. So really, we make a difference. We're not just finding out things. We're actually
Maybe the hardest.
I'm
sure you can relate to that.
No, I love it. That's when you get to see if your students have been listening. But it's a nice long job.
I think what this is about is the variety. What do you think the role of the scientist, or how do you think the process?
We might expect it to better communicate beyond the bubble. We do live in an academic bubble. Have science doing have technical terms for everything. And that used to be difficult in the L. Now these issues become sad. We have communication. I personally really love talking about what you can probably tell. There are lots of things about it's important that we share our science widely.
And from different countries, would you inspired to follow a level of knowledge that it might be to have similar to yours?
Well, I guess the first thing is to find out what really interests us, big broad thing, and they'll get you your imagination. And I would always that your curiosity and everything else will follow. But you need some good. It's really quite competitive. There's so many other things you can do to intern where you're on a section called key. You have to be able to do more and learning these skills. Anything you can do that just shows you're passionate and you're willing to go out and work hard to learn the skills, I think is important.
And if you isn't to your passion, you have to your experience in Arctic or coral reef and then you deal with any now.
I took on a student recently who was a geography student who hadn't done any doing field work. They're fantastic students. The only ways of getting those. I think the most important thing is to show your keen passion of things rather than just.
And another question on a variety of calls is a career that girls can follow?
Absolutely. I think certainly experience thing that's popular between the females in my lab and the males. They're still confident at talking about what they do. That's if they take all time better at doing tasks or the analysis and critical discussion. They just get nervous about talking about it. And I do think that talking about your science is really important. It's how you get judged as to whether you're any good at what you're doing is how you talk about it. So getting confident at talking, I think, is a really good thing that you can work at and practice. I used to be terribly nervous. My jumper used to vibrate whenever I had to talk about something. I was shaking so much, and the only way I got better at it was by doing it a lot. So you can practice, and it's a really good skill to have. And I think that's the biggest thing that people can do to help themselves get over their nerves.
Because the STEM careers have had a gender image problem, and it's wonderful to have that shared with others. It is open to anybody.
Really?
Some quick questions. Sure. What do you miss most about home?
Ooh, the dark. Sleep dark.
If you could have one food teleported to you, what would it be?
Ooh, probably a nice banana, just some fresh fruit or a bit of lettuce. That would be nice.
Brilliant. How do you limit your carbon footprint in the Arctic?
Very good question, and it is actually quite difficult because the way to stay warm is using fuel to keep us warm. These buildings are incredibly well insulated. Actually, it's as bad as you might think. But the carbon footprint from